Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story, we celebrate creativity, and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I founded the arts nonprofit 1455. You can find out more about me at seanmurphy.net. But the thing I love most about all the roles I play is it affords me an opportunity to almost always be in conversation with unbelievably talented, awesome people. And today is no exception. We welcome back my pal, the America's sweetheart, Deesha Philyaw. Let me give her the proper bio intro and then we'll jump in. But Deesha, if you don't already know, and how could you not know, especially if you're a fan of fiction or have been following the literary scene the last few years, her debut short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, won the 2021 Faulkner Award for fiction, was a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award. It's being adapted for TV by HBO Max with Tessa Thompson executive producing. Deesha is also, among other things, this is the short version, a Baldwin for the Arts Fellow, co-host of two podcasts, Ursa Short Fiction with the also amazing Dawnie Walton, and Reckon True Stories with Kiese Laymon, and her debut novel, which I hope we talk about a little bit, The True Confessions of First Lady Freeman, is forthcoming in 2026. Woo, woo. So, hello, Queen. We were hot and heavy in 2020, 2021.
Yes.
The book came out. We did an interview. We had you in the festival, and then you blew up. And I've just been a happy fan on the sidelines, like waving to the parade. So thank you for being here. It's great to see you. And how are you, my friend?
I'm great. I'm great. And I'm so happy to be here, Sean. And I just want to thank you again. You know, it's easy, I think, for people when a book has blown up to say, hey, come do my show. But you were one of the first people to embrace Church Ladies and to embrace me and to help share this book with the world before the awards. And thank you. Thank you so much for just all of your support and your friendship. And, you know, we were in those strange times on Zoom. I had a dog, Fudgy, who had separation anxiety, and you were the first person, because I kept apologizing and muting, and she also has a trachea issue, and you're like, where is Fudgy? Let's see Fudgy. And so you just sort of broke the mold in a lot of ways and just were just such a light during that time for me. And I know that you've gone on to be a light for other debut authors like my friend Brian Broom and others. So I'm thrilled to be here talking to you about your fiction debut as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
We can finish now, right? I'm satisfied. No, look, I mean, you know, it was absolutely my pleasure. That's what we do this for. And one of the things that I repeat, and we never want to repeat ourselves, but one of my mantras is, if writers aren't going to lift writers up, who else is going to do it?
That's right.
So I truly can say I consider it a combination of luck. You know, I got in early. I know quality when I see it, and I pounced all over it. But it's just been so gratifying. You know, any of us that have done this for a long time with any level of success or anything, when it happens to good people,
yes,
it lifts everyone up. So
that's
I can tell you very happily and humbly, it's been my joy. Like when a good person that deserves it has good things happen. Yes, you're happy for them. You're happy for the industry, but it shines a good light on all the writers. So you've been a blessing. You've been a blessing and a hero for a lot of us. So I could talk about that forever, but look, you got a lot going on. So why don't we just start with get us up to speed? You're doing podcasts. You got a new book deal. You're the woman about town. I mean, you look great. We
Thank
talked
you.
about Fudgy before we came on the air, so I'm good there. But
Yes, the
what give
fudgy
us
update.
yeah, what's going on and what's happening in your world right now?
Sure. As you mentioned, the two podcasts, Ursa Story is the company. It's a podcast and audio production company that I am a co-founder, co-owner, along with Dawnie Walton, my Duval sister, author of the final revival of Opal and Nev, which is a incredible novel that if you or others have not read it, please do. Dawnie and Mark Armstrong, who is the who founded Long Reads. They started a venture and brought me along to be a part of it, called Ursa Story, and we launched our podcast with Dawnie and I co-hosting, and it's devoted completely to short fiction. And we're having our season 3 launch next month. So it's been 3 seasons with great conversations and great guests. And we also have a presence on social media. We can't talk to all of the writers that we want to talk to. So we sometimes will do brief interviews. We have an associate producer, Marina Lee, who does interviews with authors talking about their writing practice, reading from their work. And I believe we're the only podcast devoted to short fiction. I could be wrong, but we have people have responded beautifully. And then recently, last month, we launched Reckon True Stories. This is a companion podcast. It's focused on nonfiction in all of its forms. And I get to co-host that one with my friend Kiese Laymon. And the response and the reception to that has been incredible. We sometimes it's just me and Kiese chopping it up on a topic. Other times we've had some great guests on. So that has been a focus for this time. And we started recording this season. We recorded last year. And it's now airing. And so we're trying to figure out what's going to happen for season 2. Hopefully there will be a season 2. As all of that's happening, as you mentioned, my novel is forthcoming in 2026. I am working with the great Rakia Clark at Mariner Books. So we are in the process of revising right now. This is my debut novel. I started this novel in 2007. It's taken on a lot of different iterations,
Yeah.
but it is a testament to not giving up. And I'm having a lot of fun writing it, revisiting some similar themes from Church Ladies.
Yeah.
The main character is the first lady of a church, a pastor's wife. There is a pageant for middle-aged pastors' wives at the center of this story. So it's funny, but it also touches on some serious themes as well. I can't shake the church, it seems. So I feel like I'm going to always be writing about church ladies. I also have a short story collection in the works called Girl Look. And it's, again, focused on Black women, mothers and daughters, which was a theme that was very prevalent in church ladies as well. And then TV, you mentioned Church Ladies being developed with HBO Max. We're still in development. Long process, very uncertain process.
Right.
But also I'm working on something new. I wrote a short story called Fuckboy Museum, uh, which is in an anthology called Peach Pit, 16 Tales of Unsavory Women. And it's a story about a middle-aged Black woman who gets tired of the aggressively average men she meets on dating apps, and she takes revenge. And I'll just leave it at that. But we have some interest from some folks in Hollywood on adapting that one for television as well. So I'm at work on that, in addition to all of these other things. So that's it. The
Well,
end.
so a couple of things. First of all, so exciting.
Thank you.
Congratulations. And I think the first thing I think of hearing all that is I'm so inspired and proud. I think what you're proving is you could have, and in some regards should have rested on your laurels and said, what I've accomplished. Let me get my breath. Let me
Mhm.
savor. And I know you savor the experience, but
Mhm.
the fact that you have kicked it up a notch and been super busy, to
Mhm.
me, says so much about, your character as an artist, your sense
Yeah.
of your sense of duty to your gift. And I think this notion of, some of us, we get to a certain age and it's like there's no denying the fact that there's not a limitless amount of time.
Right.
So it's incumbent upon us to really take advantage of the gifts we've been offered, all of which is to say,
Absolutely.
right? Like I think for writers at whatever level they're at, to hear your story is both inspiring and hopefully sufficiently intimidating. Like it doesn't necessarily get easier, but
No.
you're doing this so that you can keep doing it. And that's the
Yes.
right, that's the rock star status where
Yeah.
you afford yourself the ability to follow your muse and work
Yeah.
hard.
And I'm so grateful to be able to do this. The dream that so many of us have is I just want to write, but there's so many things that we do along the way to get that book out there that have that other work that has to sustain us.
Yeah,
And so I'm so thankful to be able to do the things that I'm doing. And so I'm giving it my all and I'm doing what I want to do.
yes,
And not worrying, people have been asking me for years, like, oh, are you worried that this next book isn't going to be, like Church Ladies, it's not going to be a success? And I'm like, it's like having two kids. You don't have a second kid and go, your older sibling's great. We're expecting you to,
that's right,
they're two separate people. They're two
right,
separate entities. It's going to be what it's going to be. And I'm not even competing with myself. Sometimes people are like, I'm not competing with anyone except myself. I'm not even competing with myself. I'm really just every day that I get to write stories, I'm so thankful for that. And
yeah,
that's really, what's the best story I can write? How can, I've got to entertain myself first, right? So what's the
that's right.
funniest story in this case, or the most interesting or the most engrossing story that I can write? And then it's a pleasure to be able to then share that with other people and hope that they can enjoy it too.
Totally. I'm so glad you say that. And, both with this podcast and through 1455, and also just
Mhm.
being the person I am, being part of and hearing conversations about writing from writers, a recurring theme that I think is really kicked up too many notches because of social media and the TMI,
Mhm. Yeah.
environment. When people are complaining about how hard it is or how unsatisfied they are, I'm always inclined to ask, like, but are you writing what you want to write? And I feel
Right.
like it's like every other enigma in life.
Mhm.
It's like the work is hard, but the
Yes.
answers are pretty simple. And if you're worried
Mhm.
about your followers and your book
Yeah.
deal and how
Mhm.
you're doing versus other writers, which is a dead end, of course,
Right.
spiritually to go down. But it's like, guys, have you not figured out if you're not scratching that deep
Yes.
spiritual itch, what are you
Yes.
even doing this for? And I never want to get on, the my soapbox and preach, but it's really more like, why would you want to be doing this if you weren't doing something that was challenging and fulfilling you
Mhm.
first and foremost?
Exactly. And and doing it for something that you can't, there's no guarantee and you have no control over.
Yeah,
That's what would be really discouraging to me. And it was, I think I had this attitude early on, but working with Hollywood where nothing is very little is in my control. I was
right.
like, whoa, let me think about what does success look like here. And have been determined, whether it's through the TV stuff or the book stuff, like I don't want my sense of my own success or the success of my work to be tied to something that other people control. The whims, the biases, all of those things. And so for me, I'm successful when I finish something, because for 20 years it took me before I could finish something that I really wanted to finish, a book length project, you
Yeah.
know? So
Yeah,
yeah.
and that tees up a question I was going to ask you. I think I know the answer, but I'd love for you to articulate yourself so I don't
Mhm.
speak for you. But I
Mhm.
do think that there's something very meaningful about, while I think all of us would love to have been successful early, or we don't.
Mhm.
I think most of us don't have any problem with anyone that gets lucky out of the gate. But I
Yeah.
think writers that have success, and by success, I'm actually just talking about getting projects
Get
done,
it done. Right.
much less
Mhm.
success. But authors for whom it's, let's just say, it doesn't come easily for any number of
Mhm.
reasons. There
Mhm.
is an extra appreciation. There's an extra, I think, humility.
Yeah.
I have a
Mhm.
feeling, knowing you like I do, you
Mm-hmm.
were that person anyway. But what I get from you is an
Mm-hmm.
extra sense of, I worked hard for this, so damn it, I'm going to enjoy it. But
Yep,
I'm also going to be humbled by the opportunities, and I think
absolutely.
that reinforces productivity.
Yeah. I mean, when Church Ladies came out, I was 49 years old and I had been writing for over 20 years, and this, I mean, that wasn't the first thing I got published, but it
Yeah,
was what I started writing fiction and I wanted to publish a book length. I thought it was going to be the novel that I'm just now publishing. Church
yeah,
Ladies was a detour from that. And before that was a co-parenting book. That was even a detour, even further detour into nonfiction.
yeah.
So it's none of this happened overnight. And so often I think people want to know, like, how do I make this happen quickly? And I'm like, it rarely happens quickly. So I
Yeah,
hope you enjoy the ride because you might be in the car for a while,
that's right.
and
Right.
and that's it for me. I've always wanted to remember why I'm doing this, and it's because I don't want to do anything else. I want to tell stories. I want to imagine. I want to play with ideas. And thinking about your book, This Kind of Man, where these very timely and timeless ideas, and with fiction, through fiction, you can play with them so expansively
Yeah,
in a way that you can somewhat with creative nonfiction, but in fiction, there's so much more that you can do. And it's like we get to do that, that the privilege of of being able to do that. And I never want to lose sight of that, because that's the one thing I can control. We
that's right.
can't control publishing, the
Right.
industry. We can't control the awards, industrial complex, or any of that, or the New York Times, all those lists and stuff. But
Yeah,
we can do that. We can be good literary citizens to each other. We can be we can be in community with each other. We can
yes.
celebrate and encourage each other. All of those things we can do. Um, and it's a privilege.
It's so wonderful to hear you articulate this, and I know people watching are going to be hopefully both inspired and informed, because this is, this is the voice of experience. So
Mhm.
I think something that we both can really have fun,
Mhm.
like let's get our craft on. We
Yes.
both have written long form. You're working
Yep.
on long form. Obviously, we both have written short. We both have written
Mhm.
nonfiction. I
Mhm.
love how, so two things. One, I really want to follow up on your comment about not only how fiction enables us to
Mhm.
get inside these lives, but one of
Mhm.
the things that I've felt pretty strongly about is, from a personal kind of aesthetic level, yes, it
Mhm.
enables us to use our imagination, and that's
Mhm.
its own joy. But
Mhm.
I've increasingly become convinced, especially in our current socio-political environment, I think
Mhm.
fiction can get inside some of these issues in ways
Yes.
that people are now inured to, journalism and the
Mhm.
same old. So, is there a problem with racism? Yes. Is there a problem with
Mhm.
sexism? Yeah. Are there a lot of systemic issues? Yeah. But they've
Mhm.
heard it and done it. So fiction
Mhm.
gives the author an
Yes.
opportunity to be political without being political. And I don't think everyone can do it well. I
Mhm.
remember when I read Church Ladies, I remember thinking, this is not a political book, but there are political acts
Yes.
happening here, because
Yes.
these are voices that couldn't or wouldn't speak for themselves. To me,
Mhm.
that's one of the real magic powers
Mhm.
of what creative writing can do.
Yes. Yes. And I think the writer's intentions, we say we tell on ourselves, right? And I think that Church Ladies would have been a very different book. And I don't think it would have resonated if I sat down in the chair and said, okay, let me, address the patriarchy and double standards and sexism in the church, as opposed to thinking about the women that I grew up with, the women in and out of the church, and how they're still with me. Like I was obsessed as a kid with wondering about their sex lives, So I think our curiosity drives us, our imagination drives us, and if we're open to receiving and remembering and all of those things, and writing the truest stories we can write fictionally, because I love what John Edgar White said. He said all stories are true, all of them. All of them are true. And so
Yeah.
that's what I've been aiming for in fiction.
Yeah.
The truths with the capital T,
Yeah.
all the systemic things, all of that stuff, it will happen. It will be there because the readers are going to bring to themselves to bear, and the present moment to bear, we just got to give them the story. We're giving them the story, and then they make meaning out of it. And what you make meaning out of it is going to be different than what somebody else, there may be some similarities, but there's going to be something because of what you bring to bear. And in some ways, that's not my business, as the writer. I'm telling the story, but it's been marvelous for me to see how men react to this book. White men, gay men, Black men, versus how different women, how church people relate to the book. And I don't control any of that. And I don't want to.
Right.
I
That's right.
love something you said in the acknowledgments of this kind of man, where you said this is not intended to answer questions, but to oblige them. And
Mm.
that's exactly it. And I think that when we don't want to replace one dogma for the other, whether it's religious or
Yeah.
political or whatever. But
Yeah.
here's this story, and it's so expansive, and it's going to raise questions. And I don't want to answer them for people. I want them to feel compelled to, ask the questions of themselves and of others as a result of having read the story. And, that's what happened for me in reading your stories. um, and can I do a little teaser for folks who may not be familiar, just so they have
Ready?
context? So I had somebody ask me, they saw me reading it and said, well, what's that about? And I said, it's about the intricacies and the devastations of men's interior lives, their vulnerabilities and their silences, as told through the voices of male characters and the women in their orbit. It's a collection of stories about marriage, family, friendship, fatherhood, sex, violence, alcoholism, faith, grief, guilt. Like I could go, you pack a lot in this small collection.
Mm.
And so, given that context, the questions that I was obliged to think about were the men in my life, particularly my father and my husband's. I've been married twice. And I really got caught on the silences. There like so many of these stories, it's about what's not said. And so that caused me to imagine. And actually, you addressed it directly in the very first story. The letter my father never wrote me. There's a line that says, if fathers and husbands talk with their wives, children, and friends about everything they want them to talk about, they may not like them. They might like them more, but they wouldn't respect them. So then I took that as a personal prompt. Like, if my dad and my husbands had told me all the things that they didn't want to talk about, would I respect them less?
Right.
And I was like, I don't think so. I don't think I'd respect them less. I think sadly, I was like, I think I would have left them all sooner. If I had, but then I had to sit with that and I was like, well, why? Why was that? So it just,
Yeah.
I love the questions that these stories stirred up in me. And that's what good fiction, I think, is supposed to do. Not tell us how to think or what to think, but to cause us to interrogate.
Well, first of all, thank you.
Mhm.
I mean, when you have someone that you genuinely admire say something nice to you, it's a very weird and beautiful thing. So thank you very, very much. I've had, as you can imagine, some interesting questions at the readings and feedback,
Mhm.
and I think all writers get used to the I didn't know this happened to you, or I didn't know you
Yeah.
were, and you have to
You're
say
like,
it didn't.
right.
But when you want to be really honest with someone and they say, "Well, did you just make it all up?" It's like, "Well, no, that's not the case." I love your it was all stories are true.
Mhm.
Tim O'Brien has talked about in the things they carried. There's something truer than truth, and that's what fiction can get at. And
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
get carried away with that, and that starts to get pretentious. But
Yes.
he's getting at there are universal truths, and that's the reason that we can read
Yes.
something that was
Mhm.
written in another language
Mhm.
2,000 years ago and feel like that totally speaks. But I
Yes.
definitely was trying to do that with this collection because for me, the prompt came out of the political environment and just looking
Mm.
around and seeing this anger and this
Mhm.
for the first time in my life seeing like being inarticulate and searching for shortcuts was
Mm.
now not only acceptable but it was like the default setting.
Mhm.
So what is this damage and how did this happen?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
how have men been done wrong by the very
Mhm.
system that does put them
It's
traditionally
right. It hurts
above
all of
women,
us.
but it
Mhm.
hurts everybody, especially the men. And so
Mhm.
imagine being an old school guy,
Mhm.
white or black, obviously. Like I can
Mhm.
think about my Boston Catholic Irish, Italian,
Mm-hmm.
grandparents, old school blue collar, but just imagine being a man that was not only told it wasn't cool to cry, but
Mm-hmm.
was punished or looked down
Mm-hmm.
upon. And then
Mm-hmm.
it starts to unravel. And to your
Right.
point, it doesn't say that it excuses it, it
Right.
doesn't exonerate bad behavior, but it shows that these pathologies are deep, and
Yes.
we can't blame it on, sorry, we can't blame it on a politician or
Mm-hmm.
a particular political movement. It's like these are systemic issues, and we have to ask a lot of questions before we can get to any answers.
Right. Because we're operating on those multiple levels. And so I think about, I said the men in my lives, like they could point to the systems that of oppression that didn't allow them to cry or be vulnerable or be honest or whatever. But then they've got to interact with me on the personal level where I'm like, okay, yes. And what are we going to disrupt this now or dismantle it in our family, in our relationship? Or are you going to hold on to the privileges that affords you because in some ways it's easier. And so I think most of us, not just men, but in general, we shy away from anything that means we've got to change. We've got to take action
Yeah,
because we don't change until it becomes the current status becomes intolerable.
right.
But it's like intolerable to whom, and so many of the men um in your stories, I was like, how selfish, at the moment where there's suffering all around them, it's what about me, and it's like, what if we could, there, it didn't have to be like a zero sum game.
Yes.
What if we could actually have a conversation, but if you've been benefiting from this system, if we're going to disrupt it and dismantle it, you've got to give up those privileges. And where, what's the willingness to do that? So there's the desire to be heard and understood, but is there the desire to either give up privilege or wield your privilege differently? And if I could have conversations with those men, those are the kinds of conversations I would have had. But I just left instead. So,
Well, I mean, we reap what we sow, right? And
yeah.
and I think, again, for me, you want to kind of illustrate the collateral damage
Yes.
in a patriarchy or in the late
Mm-hmm.
capitalist. The zero sum game, is definitely
Mm-hmm.
a through line in this
Yeah.
collection, emotionally, spiritually, financially, but showing that the prevailing system is flawed and damaged, I
Mm-hmm.
think acknowledging that leads to dialogue, it leads to
Mm-hmm.
questions. That's the way through. I
Yes.
think, whether, again, if we're looking at it through a political lens, when
Mm-hmm.
we're comfortable, even on, and I'll just say on the left, or,
Mm-hmm.
on the side that is empathetic and wants
Mm-hmm.
to be better and treats people
Right.
better, whenever we get comfortable putting people in boxes, we're shutting down the possibility of discourse. So again, for
Mm-hmm.
me, there's a very thin line, not exonerating, not even trying
Mm-hmm.
to excuse
Mm-hmm.
horrific behavior, but looking with empathy at even a
Mm-hmm.
bully and saying, what happened for that person? And
Right.
if even if they are rising to the top, I think of a Trump
Mm-hmm.
or Elon Musk,
Mm-hmm.
why do they not seem happy on any level? And what does that tell us as a
Mm-hmm.
society? I think this pursuit of zero sum power, which is
Mm-hmm.
traditionally a masculine kind of trait,
Yes.
is a dead
Right.
end. And we haven't done a good enough job, I think,
Mm-hmm.
as artists,
Mm-hmm.
taking a dark, deep look at that. So the kind of writing that I don't respond to, especially in the last decade, is what
Mm-hmm.
you described earlier. Any writer where I know in the first paragraph where they're coming from, and
Yeah.
they're almost like in the margins going, but I'm sensitive, so you understand, like I'm the good guy.
Right.
I
No.
don't have time for that.
No, because I want you as a writer to indict yourself as well, you know? And I don't, and I don't excuse myself from that either.
Yeah.
I'm gonna poke the bear a little bit. I'm working on a story now that could be a future novel. I haven't decided. It's definitely aiming towards novella. And there's a writer writing about her book, so it's very, a book within a book.
Mm,
And I started worrying as myself, oh, am I suggesting something pathological about this particular group of Black people?
Mhm.
And I was so worried that it was going to be perceived that way that I almost kind of backed off on the story. And then I thought, but that would be a fair question and criticism. And, I would have to, I would answer to that. Am I going to be a coward and not, you know,
Yeah,
face it, just say, oh, well, I'm just going to abandon this entire, novella? Or could I give that fear and that question to the writer in the story, to the character,
yeah,
and have other characters indict her? And they're indicting me as well. And so
yeah.
through that dialogue, I can answer the folks who would criticize me, who I believe will criticize me
Sure.
for what it is I'm writing. And then I had to ask myself, am I the kind of person that wants to write a book that just doesn't piss off anybody? And then I'm like, that's not interesting to me, if I
Right.
just smooth these edges. So I what you were saying about labels and boxes reminded me of, it was hard to choose a favorite story. I really liked so, there were lots of gems, but if I had to choose, I think it's Unbroken Things. And part of the reason is exactly what you said about boxes, and the main character, the narrator, kind of hits on it when he's describing his liberal woke. I don't think he used the word woke, but he's
Yeah.
got these labels for his sister, who is a professor and who eventually goes to live off the grid in Arizona, and he is an unapologetic capitalist. They're like opposites.
Yeah.
But they're siblings that obviously, have been close over the years. And so, he's chafing against all of these things, but using the kind of labels and the shorthand and the lingo. And I think so often that's the box that nonfiction can put us in. We can easily lean into the shorthand, but with fiction, we're compelled to find metaphors and to find
Yeah.
descriptive language, and to put our characters in a situation where they're breaking out of those boxes, or they surprise us, and they don't behave the way that we're used to people behaving once we label them. And I love sort of the anti-capitalist bent in this story, and how lacking in self-awareness the narrator is.
Yeah.
And so this was one of my favorite passages. He's contrasting his life, as a commuter, sort of a working guy, with his sister's life, where has a life of the mind. She's a professor. She's again in Arizona off the grid. And it was, basically no one would be this flighty if you ever had to commute, right? That like it's work, it's working and commuting, those are the things that make you grounded. And so he says, while the differences are drastic, no cars and congestion, no crowds of commuters, there's also the lack of these same things, which for me at least provide a sense of security. The rhythm of autonomy is not altogether unappealing. The routine, plodding as it can be, still serves a purpose. It reminds you you're alive, a functioning part of a system, a bigger, better cycle. To remove oneself from the mechanized march, to step outside of time, couldn't actually lead to some sort of authentic enlightenment, could it? Not for my money. And I thought that line, not for my money, was just perfect. Like, he takes us full circle, that it's all about capitalism.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's like, the system is great. I can't possibly imagine any enlightenment that could come from stepping outside of it. And then that not for my money line just really sealed it. And it's like, do you hear yourself, sir? you know?
Right. Well, so first of all, again, thank you very much. Very flattering. I think there's two things. So that story, obviously, on one level, very easy to write, in the sense of how hard is it to poke and
Yeah.
lampoon the tech bro,
Yeah.
capitalist,
Yeah.
dude. But what I wanted to do in that story, by showing and not telling, is,
Mhm.
so here is someone, if you saw him on the airplane, you'd be like, hey, living the dream. He's in his
Mhm.
suit and, rolling to
Yeah.
his business meeting. And the guy himself is showing you throughout the story he's miserable and
Yes.
doesn't know why. And at the end, he's beginning to realize, it's not because I didn't do the things I was supposed to do. It's because I did all of them. And the
Yes.
system itself that set me up to succeed has
Mhm.
ensured that I am an emotional mess, that
Mhm.
I haven't found true fulfillment. I don't even know who I am. I
Yes.
really wanted to, with nonfiction, that would be, very, I don't want to say easy, but it
Mhm.
would be shooting fish in a barrel and
Yeah.
say, I
Yes.
work with guys like this or gals like this,
Mhm.
and here's why I think, yeah, okay, we
Mhm.
get it. But to fiction allows you to
Mhm.
give someone flesh and blood and have them hang themselves instead of you, the narrator, pointing it out.
Yes. And the control, like, what that story, I love that you chose a brother and sister, because when he could not control a woman, like a wife, he starts trying to control his sister, who's perfectly fine,
Yeah.
absolutely fine. But he has decided, he's being very paternalistic and violating all kinds of boundaries, and it's just like he can't help himself. And it's like, wow, in the absence of a wife, you'll find some woman, you're gonna
That's
try
right.
and dominate somebody. And I
That's
thought,
right.
again, very telling.
Yeah, and I think it gets right to this. I think that's the American affliction right now is this
Yes,
this this determined inarticulateness, like this
yes,
proudness of ignorance,
yes.
and this fear of feelings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think I think up till say 2016, I do think, and I'm totally indicting myself. I think there
Mm-hmm.
was a tendency to be like, well, they're idiots and they'll lose out. And the reality is, first of all, we've got to try to improve.
Mm-hmm.
We can't be satisfied by saying, yeah, male chauvinist pigs are idiots, and
Mm-hmm.
never the twain shall meet. Like, how can we foster better dialogue? How can
Right.
we try to win some of these people over by just asking them about themselves, initiating a conversation where we can show some vulnerability. Because I don't assume that many men are going to read this collection and go, hey, I see myself in there. So
Right.
it's preaching to the choir, but it's almost kind of we all need to have some skin in this game
Mm-hmm.
to create the world we want to live in.
Right. Because we can't dismiss the chauvinists when they're the ones holding the power,
Right.
because what we're
That's right.
ultimately trying to do is dismantle, the power structure that empowers some and at the expense of others,
Yeah.
and how do we can't write them off as idiots,
Right.
because they're like, what is the equivalent of crazy like a fox? They are still their behavior has consequences for all of us.
Yeah.
And so I was curious, because it's obvious to me as a reader and just as a person that to write these stories you have to have had some, a great degree of awareness of these issues. So I wondered about the process of writing the book. Did you find places where you were healed, where you were like, oh, this is
Mm.
still something that's a tender spot for me, or something I need to attend to?
Such a great question. I appreciate it. I feel I said this at my first reading because my dad was there, which was
Mhm.
amazing. But I
Yeah.
literally started the reading by saying, "This is not about my dad," and I can tell him that to his
Because there's
face.
so many terrible dads. This
Yeah,
could have been called Terrible Dads.
part of it. I think it's a little bit sardonic, but
Yeah.
I truly believe like I don't think you could write a book like this if you had dads like that because you
Mhm.
wouldn't be a person that
Right.
wrote books. But
Right.
so I definitely don't want to take the easy way out and say, no, I didn't heal because I was already healed. But
Hmm.
what I think here's the short version of how this collection came together, which is, I've written a lot of nonfiction, done a lot of freelance, journalism and criticism, have always written fiction, have written poetry.
Hmm.
And going into 2016, like so many of us, I was writing more and more on my blog about politics and
Hmm.
about
Hmm.
America. And then certainly after 2016, like reacting to that. And what I started to find in my own writing is even the pieces that I thought were crushing it, partly because of the person that was in power, it was like, there's no
Hmm.
shelf life on this because we're in
Right.
this weird space where there's no bottom. And so
Mm-hmm.
it began to be much less satisfying to me to try
Hmm.
to pinpoint
Yeah.
pathologies and comment on them. And I was like, how can I get inside some of this and complicate it instead of
Hmm.
trying to explicate, like, well,
Hmm.
here's why Trump does this because his dad didn't
Right.
love him. And it's like hard to argue with that, but who's gonna read that? And so I guess I just started thinking in a fictive space where I was like,
Hmm.
what is it when so one of the early stories I wrote
Mhm.
is That's Why God Made Men. And that
Mm-hmm.
came directly out of a magazine article I read about high school football player concussions.
Right. Was
Yeah,
it the Herschel Walker one?
the story.
Yeah, there was a really long form one when he was running for whatever,
Oh,
and someone who the journalist was also a college football player in Florida. And I'll send you the link later. But
okay.
I thought when I read that story, it brought to mind this piece of journalism. But go ahead.
Well, so yeah, I know that that's been an issue, but no, there was it was a story. It was I don't remember, but it was definitely a Midwestern
Mm-hmm.
town, so it had it
Mm-hmm.
all there. And but the got me thinking about again this notion of, well, we can easily punch down on,
Yeah.
well, the poor people of course are going to do drugs because they're miserable and there's no
Mm-hmm.
jobs. All right, but what about the people that are succeeding, like the
Mm-hmm.
star athlete that's
Yeah.
in this system that's not set up to support him and his
Mm-hmm.
family, all these
Yes.
macho men. How do I I mean, I did play sports when I was younger, but I'm not
Mm-hmm.
that guy. Like, how do
Mm-hmm.
I get inside this? And for me, it was a real kind of epiphany. I was like, this story to work has to be from the mother's point of view.
Yes.
It can't
Yes.
be omniscient third person.
Yep.
There has to be
Mm-hmm.
both an inside and a distance. So
Yes.
the reader is understanding the irony, but you see these people as human beings and not as. So for me, Deesha, writing some of these, it was
Mm-hmm.
definitely imagination, but it was this culmination of all this political energy, like
Mm-hmm.
all this toxicity. Like, how do I break it out? It's like, well,
Yeah.
alcohol, violence, fathers and
Mm-hmm.
sons,
Mm-hmm.
bullying, zero sum game. And when I was filtering it through those things and using my
Mm-hmm.
imagination, I was trying to locate, you know, stories. And so then
Mm-hmm.
of course, the subconscious gets involved. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I mean, I think writing them, healing is such a great word. I would say for me, it was spiritually and intellectually satisfying to
Mm-hmm.
try to grapple with, and unfortunately, here we are today, we're still dealing with this and we
Yes.
will be, but to try to deal with this in an honest and provocative way
Mm-hmm.
where I didn't feel comfortable at the end saying, I've laid it all out for you, man. Here's what you do. Because the reality is, again, for empathy to take
Mm-hmm.
place, we
Mm-hmm.
need to try to understand like some of these people, even if everything goes right, are going to have a really hard life. And then the system is not
Mm-hmm.
only set up not to help them, it's set up to forget about them altogether.
Yeah.
So I'd like to think, I mean, I was satisfied with the way the collection came together. My only concern was it's pretty dark, you know,
Yeah.
but it's a dark
I
time.
will tell you, I had to put it down at times because it conjured pretty unhappy memories for me with those three men, my marriages and my father.
Yeah.
And it was just really hitting close to home at points. And yeah, I put it down, had to come back, pick it up again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would happily, or that's the wrong word. I would freely acknowledge, admit,
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, I had a rough life, and so little of the book is based on me. But what I can say is it unnerved me
Mm-hmm.
how easily some of these characters came together. And while I,
Mm-hmm.
of course, would love to say, well, because my imagination is so
Yes.
amazing, what I realized, Isha, is wow, how many damaged men have I
Yes.
known or heard about,
Mm-hmm.
in the news, in my life,
Mm-hmm.
in my workplace. I think the
Mm-hmm.
reality is, like in any of our books, if I went
Mm-hmm.
through literally line by line, I could probably point out and go, that part was inspired by
Got
the
it back.
story I
Mm-hmm.
read, or this was a
Mm-hmm.
coach I had, or that was a friend's
Mm-hmm.
father. So I want to give like due like diligence to the fact that some of the imaginative scenarios
Mm-hmm.
came to me. It wasn't a stretch, and I'm like, well, where did that come from if it wasn't within me? And it's like it's from the world.
It's
Just
in the
looking around.
culture.
Yeah,
It's in the culture because we have had no shortage of what's wrong with men. Men are angry, men are lonely, men are all these things. And one of the beauties of approaching the topic the way you did with the short stories is it avoids the conclusion that some of those nonfiction pieces come to, which, well, not, I don't think it's the conclusion. It's sort of just the reportage that, well, what's happening? They're angry, they're lonely, they're so forth and so on. And they're blaming women, they're blaming immigrants, so it's
Yeah.
just like, whose fault is it? And you're with the stories, we don't get into fault, even though we get into understanding, which is different from blame and fault. And I think it would be, I think, strange if there were like happy endings in these stories, because it's ongoing. And I think
Right.
that's what the stories, all the endings to me felt right.
Oh,
Because that's how it is. Like, there's not a bow at the end of it. There's no easy alternatives. People feel trapped at the end of these stories. People feel alone at the end of these stories. There's the one story, I believe it's the last one in the collection, Come and Get My Gun.
mhm.
And the last line is talk to me. And I was like, that's hopeful, even though, I won't spoil it for anybody.
Right.
Hopeful is relative here,
Yeah.
but I thought that was just really a perfect line to end on.
Well, thank you, and it was definitely intentional.
Okay.
When I was working on the collection, I will admit it was
Mm-hmm.
not like, oh, from the get-go that's going to be the closing story. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when I was, assembling, it occurred to me the theme is so much silence and lack of
Yes.
communication. For
Mm-hmm.
it to end on that somewhat hopeful note
Yes.
was very
Yes.
deliberate. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the first line in the first story is listen. So it's kind of like the bookends of the whole
Mm-hmm.
collection are what are we missing? And it's like
Mm-hmm.
talking. Is that
Yes.
going to solve all the problems? Of course not. But
Right.
boy, or do we could we use more open and honest dialogue? And that's another
Mm-hmm.
thing. I don't know. I don't specifically get into it in the collection, but
Mm-hmm.
I've talked a lot about it is also discordant that in our current moment,
Mm-hmm.
where no shortage of devices and platforms to opine, and there's so much
Yes.
noise. I think it's a combination of white noise and anger. And it's like,
Yes.
so one could say, what do you mean we need to talk more? That's all everyone does. And it's like, that's not talking. That's not dialogue. That's
Right.
noise.
Absolutely. The whole podcast, bro. It's just done so
Ah,
much harm. I mean, there's whole articles about encouraging parents to, monitor what their boys are listening to, because they're being fed this steady diet of misogyny, through a lot of these podcasts, when their minds and their perceptions of themselves, as boys, as men, and their perceptions of women and girls are so, we're being shaped by this.
right,
And so it's noise, it's not education, it's not, there's no accountability, there's, all of the
right,
things that we want
right,
for ourselves and for young people. There's responsibility, there's accountability that is all part of it. You don't get to just say things, except in
right.
this country we do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel, I'll add that last year I was in the classroom and
Hmm.
teaching undergrads. And what struck me, and there's so many things struck me, but one
Hmm.
thing that struck me was I can now crystallize why I am so grateful for having grown up in an analog era. And
Hmm.
we could go down that rabbit hole for hours, but
Yes.
I think the number one thing that's become clear to me when you see the younger generations and
Hmm.
now us like
Hmm.
this all the time is
Hmm.
we couldn't afford to be bored because we had to create our own fun. And
Yes.
by not being barraged or needing to buy
Hmm.
vinyl records, like you had to work in order to get the money
Get
to.
the
So
money.
you appreciated those things, but I think there was a cultivation of imagination and
Yes.
curiosity and
Hmm.
and this dark, well, not white space, but this space. Like it was a
Hmm.
quieter world,
Hmm.
so we could feel things and have conversations, and there
Yes.
was like there was enough silence to communicate. So I
Hmm.
think we as adults and certainly as artists, right, and
Hmm.
educators have our work to do to not set the young ones straight so much as remind them that there are ways, and art is a great platform for
Hmm.
experiencing and developing
Right.
curiosity, developing
Right.
an understanding of, wow, yeah, people that speak a different language that we're told are terrorists or
Hmm.
are, this or that are very much like us. And if I was
Hmm.
there and they were here, art can do that in ways that
Hmm.
a lot of obviously social media can't. So I
Right.
have I have more empathy for the Gen Zers and the young ones because they're just being bombarded with
Yes.
content, and we at least had to cultivate a
Right.
sensibility. I think you and I are
Right.
so old school, like there's
Yeah.
probably you and I were probably going to be the way we are no matter what,
Yes.
but at somewhere along the path, we fell in love with learning and
Hmm.
certainly reading and writing. So we had to kind of teach ourselves. So I
Yeah.
lament that the younger generation, it's actually ironically harder for them to
Hmm.
cultivate that space necessary to discover their voice.
Yes. And there's so much more that they have to filter. Whereas we pretty much knew, like, we didn't always do what we were supposed to do, but when we chose the wrong things, it was on purpose, you know?
Right,
So,
right.
but there's so much that they have to filter out. You could not pay me to be a young person right now. It's
Yeah,
it's overwhelming. They have the same capacity that we had. Actually, though, different. No, their brains are developing differently, in fact. So it's different brain capacity, but
yeah,
more demands on those same, or diminished, type the ways that their brains are developing.
right,
But their bodies are still developing, and in fact, developing more rapidly than ours.
right,
So they are like little time bombs. But we hold the same expectations of them,
right,
that we
right.
of, how we were raised. And, we all think, oh, well, when I become a parent, well, it's a whole different world. It's a whole different world.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, I will never say that art is the answer, but I think
Hmm.
one of the things that you and I would probably agree is that
Hmm.
art is definitely one way to
Yes.
complicate already complicated issues. And
Yes.
I think that's the thing a lot of our political pundits are missing is it needs to be more complicated to
Right.
arrive at agreement and consensus by trying to find or shoehorn
Hmm.
solutions or hack the problem. The
Hmm.
shortcuts are going to continue to make us run in circles, but an honest engagement with empathy and curiosity
Hmm.
will yield, maybe one reader at a time, and
Right.
we can foster dialogue, and that gives me an opportunity to both thank and celebrate the fact that you're using your platform obviously through your writing and
Thank
your
you.
championing of other voices, but using the podcast, like you don't have to work as hard as you do, and you choose to. You're
Right.
making the literary and cultural world a better place. We need to pay attention to that and be properly grateful for what you do.
Yeah. You just reminded me, I mean, one of the reasons, one of the benefits of creating these types of media is we're in competition, for young people's attention and their time. Um, just as the arts are being cut, and look who's cutting the arts,
That's right.
and so the platforms that, you and I find ourselves on, that they can't cut us, and so, we're there. But meeting young people where they are, I'm always excited when, middle schoolers and high schoolers are reading my book, or, I was invited to a high school in my hometown. It's a school for the arts. And they have, the musical theater, they have dance, all the different arts, and they
Yeah.
have a writing program. And they have parent boosters, just like a football team would have parent boosters. And they throw a big festival every other year, and they bring in nationally known writers. They always bring in a prose writer and a poet to
Mhm.
spend a Saturday, and the kids come out. It's one of the best festivals I've ever attended.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is what these young writers need. It is an antidote to all of the noise. And
Yeah.
then I thought, but every young person should have that. That should just be part of it, to, seeing artists at work in all of our different disciplines,
Yeah.
but that group of parents, they made it happen,
That's right.
and so, just as a side.
No, I love it. And I think that's a reminder too, right? It's a granular, one book at a time, one conversation at a
Mm-hmm.
time, one effort at a time.
Yes.
And it leads me back to what we talked about, 4 years ago, and we'll be talking about in 4 years,
Mm-hmm.
being a good literary citizen,
Mm-hmm.
fostering community, understanding the power of
Mm-hmm.
community, even or maybe especially within our artistic kind of
Mm-hmm.
micro communities. Very
Yes.
solitary work, not
Mm-hmm.
very rewarding for many people
Mm-hmm.
financially,
Right.
maybe spiritually. We need to lift each other up. We need to promote each other. We need to shine a light and use our platforms
Mm-hmm.
responsibly and generously. I can't think of a better person to put on that kind of pedestal and say, this is how it's done. So it's a tremendous blessing and honor to call you a friend and be able to
Thank
chat with
you.
you and use you often as an example of this
Thank
is
you.
how it's done as a writer and as a human being.
I appreciate that, Sean. Thank you so much. I'm glad we got to talk about your work, and I can give back a fraction of what you have done for me and for so many others. So thank you.
Well, suffice it to say, the door is always open. So
Thank you.
let's, as things start to take shape with some of these other endeavors, let's
Yes,
make
I'll be in
let's make
touch.
sure that your people talk to my people.
Yes.
I'm gonna put it in all the links, but I would be remiss.
Okay.
Tell everyone how they can find you. It'll be all
Okay.
over but yeah, let everyone know how to find Deesha.
Sure. So I have a website, deeshaphilyaw.com. That's pretty static though. But I'm at my name, Deesha Philyaw, on all the social media platforms.
Okay, go seek her out. Deesha, thank you for being here. You are a bright
You.
light. I love you. I thank
Oh,
you. I
me
appreciate
too.
you. Folks, thank you for checking out Some Things Considered. Remember, this is the podcast where we celebrate creativity. We're obsessed with story. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think. Send your people our way. We want to talk to them. We'll see you on the next one. And once again, be kind and be well. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.